So tomorrow is Asara B'Tevet, the fast day that commemorates the date on which the Babylonians began their siege of Jerusalem, some 2,600 years ago, in the year 588 BCE. And the classic question that you might ask about this fast day is this: why fast for the beginning of a siege? Why is that the kind of thing that would even call for a fast day of its own? It seems a little bit odd, especially because we all know how the story ends. The people of Yerushalayim hold out for 18 months, but ultimately the siege was successful, and the Babylonians conquered the city and destroyed the first Beit HaMikdash, as we know, on Tisha B'Av. And once we know that the siege is going to be successful, and once we know that the Beit HaMikdash is going to be destroyed, again, you'd ask, why have a separate fast day to commemorate the beginning of the siege that starts all of this? At that point, the beginning of the siege feels like more of a detail along the way. So let's consider, why did Chazal determine that the beginning of the siege merited its own fast day? And there are a number of reasons that you could give. I guess the simplest might be that you could think of this as almost like a negative dayenu, right? So I'm going to try to sing, excuse my singing, but it's kind of like, even if we had only been under siege and the Beit HaMikdash had not been destroyed, dayenu, right? Even if only the siege had happened and the Beit HaMikdash had not been destroyed at the end, that alone would be enough reason to mourn and to fast. And there's no question that sieges are particularly terrible. All you have to do is read the book of Eicha, for example, about the description of mothers eating their own children to fend off starvation, and that gives you a very vivid sense of how bad it is to live under siege. And that image of what desperation does to a person leads to another important point, which is the experience of being under siege is destructive in a way that goes beyond the end game of what happens when the siege comes to an end, right? So living under siege itself is corrosive. It's a tragedy in its own right. Okay, so with that as background. Once we start thinking about the tragedy of a siege in that way, it's interesting to broaden the frame a little bit. So tonight, that's what we're going to do. We're going to think about the idea of living under siege in a way that's broader than just about literal sieges by actual armies. And we're going to think about what it means to live your life as if you're under siege, because I think that is a feeling that Jews have felt many times through our history. And I actually think it's a feeling that sometimes we feel as Jews even today. So that's part of where we're headed. We're going to think about Asara B'Tevet, not just in its historical background, but also how we might connect to it in a little bit more modern way, more contemporary way today. Okay, but before we get into all of that, let's start with the basics and then we'll build up. So the month of Tevet is the 10th month of the Jewish calendar. It has no holidays in it. Recall that the month of Mar Cheshvan got a lot more press for having no holidays. We all learn when we're kids the name Mar Cheshvan, that it's a bitter month that has no holidays. Tevet is the same, they have no holidays to celebrate, and it goes even one step further. There are no happy days in the month, and there's a sad day, the fast of Asara B'Tevet, the 10th day of the month. And that fast is part of a cycle of fasts that commemorate the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And those fasts date back to biblical times. They're actually mentioned by the prophet Zechariah. So the prophet Zechariah says, Som HaRevi'i, the fast of the 4th month, presumably that's the 17th of Tammuz, the Tzom HaChamishi, and the fast of the 5th month, which presumably is Tisha B'Av, the Tzom HaShavi'i, the fast of the 7th month, presumably it's Tzom Gedalia, the Tzom HaAsiri, the fast of the 10th month, that's us, right? That's Asara B'Tevet. All of those, which have to do with the cycle of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, Yeh, Leveit Yehuda, L'Sason, L'Simcha, U'Lemoadim Tovim, those someday in the days of Mashiach, or future days to come, will become holidays. And then it has this beautiful line, which we actually say on, at the end of, towards the end of the Hineni on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, his last line, V'ha'emet, v'ha'shalom ehavu. That's actually a little bit of a hard line to translate, but it's a beautiful line. Ha'emet, v'ha'shalom ehavu. Something like truth and peace will be reconciled. And one way to think about that is that the truth of our history is that it has not always been particularly peaceful. So perhaps another way of interpreting that line is, in times to come, we will be able to find peace, shalom, even with the truth, even with ha'emet. Ha'emet ve'hashalom ehavu. We will be able to reconcile peace and truth. We will be able to make peace even with the truth, is one kind of way that you might translate that. And in modern times, it's interesting that the chief rabbinate of the state of Israel chose the 10th of Tevet as, quote, Yom HaKadish HaKlali, a general day for saying Kaddish. It actually was a day set up to allow people to celebrate the yortzites of relatives whose actual date of death was not known, as was, for example, the case with many victims of the Holocaust. And so you might say, maybe for these people, the fact that the state of Israel, a Jewish state that they could never have even imagined would exist during the Shoah, the fact that that state creates for them a day on which to mourn and commemorate loved ones allows them to find peace even with the truth. So maybe that's a way of reading that line. Okay, so as I said, let's widen the frame a little bit. Let's think about what it means to live under siege in a broader way, not just an army literally at the gates. Because sometimes you can feel like you're living under siege even without an actual invading army outside. So for example, this is a story we're going to dig into a bunch tonight. For hundreds of years, the Jews of European cities lived behind walls in ghettos meant to keep them separate and downtrodden. And this too was a kind of siege that we lived under for centuries. And I started to think about the connection between siege and that life lived behind ghetto walls this summer when I traveled with my family to Italy. Because when we were in Italy, we visited the ghettos of Rome and Florence and Venice. And these are places where people just like us were forced to live behind walls, you might say, to live under siege. And Venice, as many of you probably know, is the place where the word ghetto was first coined. Right? So the law of the ghetto was imposed on the Jews of Venice in the year 1516. The Jews were forced by law to move to a corner of the city in an area that had previously been housed a foundry, okay, so not the greatest part of town. And they had to live in this small self-contained area, and the gates of the ghetto were locked each night. And there were other laws. Jews could only work in certain professions, and they had to wear certain distinctive items of clothing. Okay, now bear in mind the context, which we don't always think about. Strangely, this was far better than what Spain had recently done to their Jewish community 24 years before that, when the entire Jewish community of Spain was given the choice to either convert or leave in the year 1492, and Portugal did the same thing just a few years after. So oddly, the Venetians, in kind of maybe in their minds, were being rather liberal in not kicking out their Jews, but only banishing them to live in this out of the way corner of town, kind of a twisted way of thinking about the world. And what struck me when we visited the ghetto of Venice this summer is that the dates that we're talking about are astonishing, okay, when you think about it. 1516 is right in the middle of the High Renaissance. So in school, we learn about the Renaissance as a time of incredible open-mindedness and a time when the old ways and superstitions of the Middle Ages were being replaced with a wave of scientific discoveries and creative artistic expressions. And on our trip, we spent most of our days touring the beautiful cities and seeing the masterpieces that emerged in this period. But history is complicated. And at the same time, as for example, the Renaissance painter Titian was painting masterpieces to decorate the palaces of the Venetian nobility, those same nobles, those same open-minded nobles who were seeing this new future emerging, decreed that the Jews of their city needed to be segregated from the rest of the population and constrained by law to live in a corner of the city and locked up each night. Okay, and the experience of the Jewish community of Rome is also particularly instructive, because Rome's ghetto is also a product of the 16th century. That came a few years later. The Rome ghetto started in the year 1555 by Pope Paul IV, who decreed that the Jews of Rome had to live behind ghetto walls and wear special yellow markings on their clothes. And Rome's ghetto was a little different. It wasn't placed out at the edge of the city like Venice's was. Instead, the Roman ghetto was right in the middle of town. The Roman ghetto was actually kind of like a showpiece where the popes showed how Jews ought to behave. And it's worthwhile to think about the context of what was going on at that time, because we don't live in a vacuum. To some extent, the Jews of that time were swept up in a broader religious conflict that was going on across Europe, So to give you a sense of the years that we're talking about, just so that we're all on the same page. So Martin Luther nailed his list of 95 theses, right? His 95 grievances against the church on the door of the church in Wittenberg in the year 1517. And he'd been agitating for years before that, but that's when he really, that's typically the date that people use for what kicked off the Protestant Reformation, kind of a religious and political earthquake that hit Europe. And so by 18 years later, for example, in 1535, King Henry VIII of England cut ties with the Catholic Church, and he establishes the Church of England with himself as the head. So these are just the currents that were sweeping through Europe in the early 1500s. Right? That's the time, the early 1500s, when the Venice Ghetto was founded. The church was losing its sway over Northern Europe, and the entire continent was actually heading into religious wars that would last for a generation, for generations. But the church didn't just give up. Okay, the Reformation, with all of its liberal revolt against the church, led to a conservative counter-reformation. And the counter-reformation, that's the name that we give to a kind of return to traditionalism that emerged as a reaction to the Reformation. So the counter-reformation was the church's attempt to punch back to a threat against its authority. And so this is, again, the period that we're talking about. In Rome in particular, the seat of the Catholic Church, there was pressure to punch back particularly hard. And so by 1542, Rome had an inquisition designed to root out heretics. By 1545, the church called together this thing called the Council of Trent, and they sat down and they came up with the specifics of what church dogma was, and who was on the right side of that dogma and who was on the wrong side of that dogma. And Europe would be bogged down, as I said, in these internal wars between Protestants and Catholic kingdoms that would last for the next 100 years. And it's not a coincidence. The Jews, who had been the longtime targets of church-led discrimination across Europe, were going to suffer tougher than normally during times like this, when the whole continent was caught up in religious wars. And so in 1553, so this is 2 years before the ghetto was created, the Roman Inquisition determined that the Talmud was a heretical work and had to be rooted out through all of Italy. So on Rosh Hashanah, in the year 1553, there were public burnings of Jewish books in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome. That today is a beautiful town square that has a very cute farmer's market. It's about 10 minutes walk from what would become the Jewish ghetto of Rome. But that's the place where in the dark days, Jewish books were burned. And I guess we should note that if you go to the Campo de' Fiori today, there's actually a statue right in the middle that commemorates the execution of a heretic, not a Jewish heretic, but a guy named Giordano Bruno. He was burned at the stake in the year 1600. And it's just to point out something that we know, that when people start by burning books, it won't be long before they turn to burning people as well. And that is what happened. So also, just one more amazing thing that was going on in that period. The church began a practice of holding Shabbat afternoon services to the Jews of Rome. So every Shabbat, the Jewish community of Rome was forced by law to send 250 of its members. That's almost 10% of the total population of Rome, Jewish population of Rome at the time. There were about 3,000 Jews. So 250 by name, you'd have to kind of give your roster to the church and say, these are the folks that are coming to hear the priest's sermon this Shabbos. It was like some kind of twisted Parsha Shiur that took place every week. The Jews were made to sit and listen to priests who many times were actually former Jewish apostates. And they would lecture to them based on that week's Parsha. And they would explain how the true meaning of the Parsha was that Judaism was false and Christianity was true. Okay, so all of this was going on in this period, the 16th century. That's the world in which Jews were forced to live, as I'm describing, under siege, literally behind walls, but also with this deeper sense that they were living a life that was under siege. And to be clear, I guess this isn't to say that the Reformation, that the Counter-Reformation explain why the Jews were being forced to live in ghettos and mistreated in this way. I don't want to say that at all. I mean, we saw that the Venice ghetto preceded the Reformation. It dates back earlier. And the phenomenon of Jews being forced to live in a distinct, walled portion of the city is older, and it existed before the word ghetto. And certainly Jewish expulsions from different territories is a far older phenomenon. England had expelled its Jews in the year 1290, okay? And German cities and municipalities has expelled their Jews over the years, and it's just part of a larger history. But that said, the story of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, I raise it because they're just an important backdrop as we think about how the Jews of Rome in particular, and other Italian cities, experienced this feeling of being under siege and put into ghettos, specifically in the 16th century. Okay, so this isn't the first time something like that had happened, but it is a notable example of this type of persecution. And so tonight, I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about Rome's Jewish community, because I think that story is particularly tragic and interesting, and I think will bring us back in a lot of ways to Asarabet Tevet. So I'm going to go one level deeper into that story of the Roman Jewish community and the Roman ghetto in particular. So the walls of the Roman ghetto stood from 1555, as I mentioned, until 1798, which is the year that Napoleon's army rolled in. And Napoleon, when he came in, abolished ghettos in every place that he conquered across Europe. So essentially, it took the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror and the Napoleonic Wars, all of that kind of had to happen to free Jews of its ghettos, Jews of Europe of their ghettos across Europe. And that period of Napoleon rolling in the Napoleonic Wars, so that was kind of a period in which Europe was radically changing, and the old world was in some ways dying out, and there was some chance for a new start. But in Rome, things were different. So back then, there was no country of Italy. Italy didn't exist as a country. There were different regions of what we now call Italy that had different rulers. And Rome was part of what was called the Papal States. And they actually were restored. After Napoleon came in, they were actually restored to church control as opposed to other parts of Italy, just 1 year after Napoleon's victories. Okay, so imagine that you're a Jewish person living in the ghetto of Rome, which had existed for hundreds of years. Then Napoleon comes in, he annuls the ghetto laws. But then 1 year later, the rules change back again. The church is back in charge, and the old ghetto laws were reestablished. And so any Jews who had managed to leave the ghetto were forced to move right back in just a year later. Rome's ghetto stayed in place until 1870. That's roughly 70 years after Napoleon had outlawed the ghetto. So then you think about it and you say, wow, in the scheme of things, 1870 really isn't that long ago. Okay, so just to use dates that we kind of think about, in US history, the US Civil War, ends in 1865. At that time, Jews of Rome are still living by law behind ghetto walls. In the late 1800s, as you start to move into the late 1800s, and that's a time of tremendous modernization in Europe. Within a decade, the streets of Paris are going to have electric lights. It will truly be the city of lights, right? And Rome's Jewish community emerges from the ghetto, finally, after hundreds of years, into this modern period. Okay, so in 1870, after standing for over 300 years, the Roman ghetto was the last ghetto in Europe to be abolished. And it happened because the Papal States were dissolved when Rome became part of a newly created Kingdom of Italy. So it's really amazing that it's not like the ghetto ended because the church came around and decided to abolish it. What happened was that the ghetto was dismantled first under outside force when Napoleon conquered, and then later when, again, kind of the politics changed, or the map changed, and the Kingdom of Italy replaced the Papal States. And so this was a tremendously joyous time for the Jews of Rome. At the end of papal rule and the rise of this new kingdom, there's this new optimism for this amazing community that had an ancient community that had been there for thousands of years and had survived so much. Okay, so for any of you who've been to Rome, you would recall that the Jewish community, not long afterwards, right, in the year 1904, so right, the ghetto kind of ends in the late 1800s, and by 1904, the Jewish community has this optimism that it's time for them to build a grand, beautiful, great synagogue. And that shul, which you can visit today, is gorgeous, really gets across the ambitions of the community at that time. Now, little did the Jewish community of Rome know that the ghetto would be reestablished again within the span of just one lifetime under the order of the Nazis. So when the ghetto was reestablished in World War II, again, this is hard to imagine, but there were people who had been born in the ghetto and then saw the ghetto walls torn down and had left, and then had to return again with their children and grandchildren as they were rounded up into the ghetto once again. They lived under siege, they'd survived that siege, and then they found themselves and their families living under siege again. It's hard for us to imagine this. Though we should know, don't want to fail to mention that the Jewish community of Italy did far better than most European communities that were occupied by the Nazis during World War II. Nevertheless, many were sent to their deaths in Auschwitz. So it's, as a matter of degree, it was a better place, but obviously horrific. Nevertheless. Okay, now, and that so ends the chapter of World War II. But even after the war, when the Jewish community of Rome began to try to rebuild, they'd have to endure actually one of the strangest and most tragic stories of the period right after World War II. Some of you may have heard of this story. I had not heard about it until fairly recently, which was the story of Rabbi Yisrael Zoli, who was the chief rabbi of Rome during World War II, during that period. And during the war, especially during the years of German occupation, Rabbi Zoli spent time in hiding, and the church actually protected him during that period. And in June of 1944, Rabbi Zoli presided over a ceremony held in the Great Synagogue of Rome, that beautiful shul that had been opened and then seen the ghetto kind of reimposed. So at the end, as war in Europe had come to an end, there was this ceremony held in the Great Synagogue of Rome to celebrate the end of Nazi occupation and to commemorate those who had died during the war. And Rabbi Zoli's three brothers had died in the Holocaust. Okay, now, 9 months later, 9 months after he presided as chief rabbi over that ceremony, out of nowhere, and to his congregation's shock, Rabbi Yisrael Zoli announced that he was converting to Catholicism. And the community was distraught after all they'd been through, right? Can you even imagine it? And the community gathered in that same great synagogue, the beautiful show that was supposed to represent all the optimism of the generation of Roman Jews who'd seen the ghetto walls fall. And that community came and mourned their rabbi as if he was dead. They sat shiva for him. Again, this was not a city living under siege by foreign armies, but you have to think of that as a community that lived under an unrelenting siege for so many years. So why go through this whole story, the Roman ghetto and the Roman community? Because I think it gives a sense of how living under siege is something that's a tragedy of its own kind, as a separate matter from whatever tragedies may take place at the end of the siege process. And that's why, just to bring us back to the time of year that we're in, maybe that's something to think about as we approach Asara B'Tevet. Maybe that's what the fast of the 10th of Tevet is about, forcing us to recognize that a Jewish life lived under siege is a particular kind of tragedy. Okay, and there's a mashal in Tanakh that I think beautifully describes what a siege is like. I'm going to put it up. We'll go through it together. I know this, it's funny, as opposed to most of the shiurim, we're not doing as much actual Torah in this year, but anyways, hopefully this kind of gets us to a good place nonetheless. But let's go through a prophecy from the book of Yechezkel that has to do with the siege. Okay, so this is the 24th chapter of the book of Yechezkel. He says, in the 9th year, on the 10th day of the 10th month, so that's actually Asara B'Tevet, the word of Hashem came to me. O mortal, record this date, this exact day. Yeah, our day that's coming up. For this very day, the king of Babel has laid siege to Yerushalayim. Further, speak in an allegory, a mashal, to the rebellious breed and say to them, thus says Hashem, put the cauldron on the fire, put it on, and then pour water into it. Collect in it pieces of meat, every choice piece, thigh and shoulder. Fill it with the best cuts. Okay, so what's he saying? Kind of like take a cholent pot and fill it up. You're going to make a stew with all the best cuts. Put all the best stuff that you've got into this pot and light the fire. And then I'm going to skip a little bit. It says, surely, Komar Hashem, thus says Hashem, woe to the city of blood. In turn will make a great blaze, pile on the logs, kindle the fire, cook the meat through, and stew it completely. And let the bones be charred. Let it stand empty on the coals until it becomes so hot that the copper glows. And eventually its thick scum will not leave it. Let's think about what this prophecy of Asara B'Tevet might be getting. Can't say that the vision is entirely clear, though none of the visions of Yechezkel are often quite esoteric, and obviously there are commentaries who will do a better job of getting to the depths of it. But at a surface level, the message seems to be this stewing pot that stews and cooks all the way down, that the choicest, most beautiful cuts become nothing but a sludge. Another way of saying that is that the experience of being under siege is like a frog being slowly boiled in water. Okay, at first, the heat seems manageable. At first, in the mashal, you're making a beautiful stew of all the best stuff. But as it keeps cooking, as the pressure keeps mounting, the outside pressure becomes so much, it builds, until eventually you are boiled alive, okay? It becomes unbearable. And that's what a siege is, okay? So long before the Shoah, in our European example, Jewish life in Eastern Europe was a life lived under siege. If the Shoah is the destruction of European Jewry, right, the Tisha B'Av of that story, the destruction, then it's just the final chapter of a much longer history of a brutal siege, which we might say is more akin to Asara B'Tevet, okay? So Tisha B'Av calls for one kind of mourning, for the destruction. Asara B'Tevet calls for a different kind of mourning, for a life lived under siege over a long period of time, as if being cooked alive in Yechezkel's imagery. Now, we live in far better times today, and we need to be thankful for that every day. But on at least one day a year, on Asara B'Tevet, Jewish history calls out to us to take stock of whether we too are living under siege in some way, in some lighter way. Are we like the frog sitting in the pot, which seems to be getting hotter and hotter? Okay, and it makes us think about, for example, the Gemara in Tamid that describes a discussion, famous discussion between Alexander the Great and the elders of the Negev. And Alexander says to the elders, he says, who do you call wise? Okay, Amar lahem, idin matkari chachim. Okay, Alexander the Great basically asked the Jewish elders, who do you call wise? And the line that is more famous, Amulei, they answered him, Ezahu chacham haro'eh et hanolah. Who is wise? The person who sees what's coming. Okay. Jews need to see what's coming because by the time it gets here, it's too late for us. And maybe that's part of the message as well of fasting on Asara B'Tevet is to commemorate the beginning of the siege. Okay, because the beginning of a siege is worth noting. Again, once the siege is in full force, you're like the frog being cooked alive. Perhaps it's too late. Okay, so perhaps the fast of Asara B'Tevet with this kind of background forces us to think about what do you do if you're living under siege in your day? What do you do about it? And that makes us think about how a siege ends, because a siege can end in a number of different ways. So one option is a siege ends when you give up, when you surrender. And many Jews did exactly that. They converted. They disappeared. At best, they became crypto-Jews, right, the Moranos. And we saw that even the chief rabbi of Rome chose that direction. So that's one option, not a great one. A second option is you can hope to wait out the siege. Okay, you can hunker down and you can hope that you can outlast the enemy. You can hope for the best, and you can pray. And that strategy has very good yichus. The best example from Tanakh of waiting out a siege successfully comes from the story of King Chizkiyahu, when the Assyrians marched on Yerushalayim in the year 701 BCE. Okay? Keep in mind that when they reached the walls of Jerusalem, that was the same Assyrian kingdom that had completely destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and carried away the 10 lost tribes about 20 years beforehand. So when the book of Malachim Bet tells us as follows, it says, in the 14th year of King Chizkiyahu, King Sancheriv of Assyria, of Ashur, marched against all the fortified towns of Yehuda and seized them. Okay, so, quote, so if you're Chizkiyahu, you've seen that this kingdom of Ashur has destroyed the entire kingdom of Israel, marched them off, never to be seen again. And that same kingdom has actually conquered the towns of the kingdom of Yehuda. And pretty much it's just the capital that's left. And Chizkiyahu tries to buy off the Assyrians. First, he sends them tribute, he sends them money, sends them things that might satisfy them, but that's not enough. And the Assyrians besiege Jerusalem. Now, Chizkiyahu was ready. He had built fortifications. Some of you have seen those fortifications. When you go to the old city and they show you the broad wall that runs through the Jewish quarter, it ran through other parts, but we see it, the part that ran through the Jewish quarter and has been excavated, that's the wall that Chizkiyahu built, waiting for the Assyrians to come and attack. Okay? And more than that, we're told that Chizkiyahu prayed to Hashem for salvation. So, for example, the prophet Yeshayahu tells us, right, in the 37th chapter of the book of Yeshayahu, this is what Yeshayahu says to King Chizkiyahu at the time. He says, and I'm going to do all this. I think I'm just going to do it in English, just because I know we're short on time. We're okay, so he says, Kol Amar Hashem. Actually, I'll mix it up. He says, Kol Amar Hashem. El Melech Ashur. This is what Hashem will say to the king of Assyria, maybe with regard to the king of Assyria. Lo yavo elai ir hazot. He will not enter this city. And he goes on. He's not going to enter the city. He's not going to shoot an arrow against it. He will, and then eventually, Yeshayahu says, "Baderech asher ba yashuv." The path that he came, the road that he came here, he will go back on that road. He will not enter this city, says Hashem. And again, the prophet continues on with this prophecy, and then we are told that night, an angel of Hashem went out and struck down 185,000 members of the Assyrian war camp. The following morning, they were all corpses. Okay, the following morning, Baboker v'hineh kulam yarim metim. They were all dead. And then it says, so the king Sancheriv of Ashur retreated, and he went back to Nineveh. Okay, now this is the story as it's told to us in the book of Yeshayahu, similarly in the book of Malachim Bet. Amazingly, we actually have the story of the siege of Jerusalem from the Assyrian point of view as well. Some of you may know this, that if you go to the British Museum, I'm going to put this up because it's just so cool to share. If you go to the British Museum, you can see something called the Sennacherib prison. This actually is from the days of King Sancheriv. And this is tiny script written in the language Akkadian. Okay, so this just gives you a cool feel of what this thing looks like. And in Akkadian, it says, quote, as for Chizkiyahu the Judean, who did not submit to my yoke, like a caged bird, I shut him up in Yerushalayim, his royal city. Okay, and quote, and the Assyrian history doesn't talk about any miraculous salvation of Yerushalayim, but Sancheriv's own records make clear that while the Assyrian army captured and destroyed many other cities in Judea and put a heavy tribute on King Chizkiyahu, these are all things that Tanakh had said as well, the Assyrian records imply that they didn't conquer or destroy Yerushalayim itself. Okay, so in the case of with all that background, in the case of Chizkiyahu, building a defensive wall and waiting out the siege and praying worked. But to bring us back to Asar Tevet, perhaps part of the message of that siege that started by the Babylonians in 588 BC is that, as opposed to in the case of the Assyrian siege, building a wall was not enough. Trying to wait out the enemy and praying was not enough. It's not always a winning strategy. In fact, you could say that the whole cycle of fasts from Asar Tevet all the way through Tisha B'Av reminds us that the waited out strategy is not always destined for success. So there's a third option of what you can do when you're under siege. But this one requires thinking out of the box a bit more. you can try to break the siege. Your army can come to your defense. Rather than you're just sitting behind walls and waiting and hoping and praying, you can try to fight back. You can try to change the game. And in the more modern Jewish experience, you might say that that's in part what Zionism was. It was an attempt to change the game after many, many years of trying the old strategy of hunkering down and hoping to ride out the siege. And it's exactly during this period of history that we were talking about, as we enter the modern era, around the time when the Roman ghetto was finally opening up, right? The Roman ghetto ends in 1870. So let's think about some of the Jewish currents that were going on in those days. Well, some of the currents of thought that were emerging at the time that that community was finally able to leave their siege, the siege that they had experienced. So I'm not going to go through it in endless detail, but just to remind ourselves of the time frame. In 1862, less than a decade before the fall of the Roman ghetto, a German Jew named Moses Hess wrote a book called Rome and Jerusalem. And at that time, you know, as we discussed, the Rome ghetto was still standing. And Hess argued that Jewish assimilation in Europe would never work, that Jews would never truly be accepted there. They would always be a separate and lesser people, a hated, historically hated minority group. Hadn't the Jewish people learned by now, Hess asked, that there was no other option but to try something new? And he argued that a Jewish return to the land of Israel and the founding of a socialist agrarian country there was the only solution. And about 20 years later, Leon Pinsker wrote the influential pamphlet, Auto-Emancipation, making a similar kind of argument that you might say Napoleonic emancipation, meaning the kind of emancipation that other people bestow upon you, was never really going to work. But Pinsker argued the Jews would have to emancipate themselves and claim their rightful position as a sovereign people for it ever to be effective. And this is also the same time frame at the end of the 1800s when the first Aliyah starts to take place. European Jews start to move in some numbers to Turkish-ruled, the land of Israel. And in 1896, Herzl publishes The Jewish State. The first Zionist Congress is in 1897. So this is just to give a sense, right? As we all know, political Zionism was this new idea for a new time. Zionism and Jewish nationalism was a modern solution to an ancient problem. And just like the Counter-Reformation is just an important backdrop to help us understand how the Jews of Rome wound up behind ghetto walls in the first place. So too, I'm just trying to paint a context for some of the things that were going on in the modern world that they would have found when they left the last standing ghetto in the world. Now, we all know that the momentum surrounding Zionism arrived too late to save European Jews from what was to come. And the Jews of Rome themselves would find themselves back in the ghetto walls not too long thereafter. So if Zionism was an attempt to break the siege, it arrived too late to stop the oncoming destruction. But nevertheless, there's no doubt that Zionism changed the game. And that story I also want to tell through the lens of the Roman Jewish community. This is an interesting way to just put a face on some of the changes that were happening at that time. Okay, so the Jewish community of Rome, we left off in 1945 with the shocking apostasy of their chief rabbi. Okay, now, so in 1945, when we left them, the Jewish community of Rome was sitting Shiva for their chief rabbi. Fast forward 3 years later. This is an amazing picture. Some of you may have seen it. I love this picture. So this picture is of Jewish people gathering in 1948 at the Arch of Titus. The Arch of Titus, as we know, is this, this arch that was created by the Romans to help celebrate the fact that they had won this war over Judea in the year 70, right? The destruction of Satan and the second Beit HaMikdash happens at that time. And the monument has the famous relief that shows Roman soldiers guiding Jewish slaves carrying the holy vessels on their back, including the menorah. We all know that image. Now, many of the people, so this was 1948, many of the people in this picture are European refugees who were living in DP camps, and they were waiting to emigrate to Israel. And I can't, this will actually be blurry. I won't be able to zoom enough for it to become clear. But if you get a sharp picture of this, you will see that there are pictures that say things in Hebrew, signs that say, long live the Hebrew state. And amazingly, thank you to the United States and Russia for helping establish the state. Okay, so I find this picture incredibly moving because starting in the 16th century, that period that when the Roman ghetto first went up, okay, starting in that time, the Jews of Rome were actually made to come to the Arch of Titus every year and make an oath of submission while standing at the arch. And it was the same arch that their forefathers, some of them at least, had walked through as slaves 1,500 years before. And the message was very clear from the church to the Jews of Rome. Your forefathers came here as slaves, and you will always be beneath us. And you will swear to that once a year. And it became customary in the Jewish community to never walk through the Arch of Titus. That was considered a sign of submitting to slavery, almost, to submitting to your fate. So Jews never walked under the Arch of Titus. But now, in 1948, for the first time, you can see in the picture, Jewish people finally felt confident enough to walk under the arch for the first time in hundreds of years without feeling second class. Okay, so the arch was the same. The history was the same, but the people walking through it now suddenly viewed themselves differently. And maybe that's what you might say is breaking the siege. That's that concept of breaking the siege, okay? Or at least trying to. And just one more picture, just in the same kind of concept, right? So this is the seal of the state of Israel. And this is the Arch of Titus, that relief on the inside. And what stands out here, again, you may know this, but you may not, is that this menorah is specifically modeled after this menorah. Okay, so if you look at it, we have lots of different pictures about what the menorah might have looked like. There are different sources. And in general, this base is not the common one. If you look at all the pictures that we have, the base does not typically look like this, okay? But it does look like this specifically in the Arch of Titus. And so too, just this is that menorah. And the message of the seal of the state of Israel is clear, that Israel is meant to be an undoing of that history. Or maybe you could say of that history, depending on how you want to frame it. And certainly that's the line from Hatikva, right? Hatikva bat shnot alpayim, the 2,000-year hope. What is that 2,000? What is 2,000 years before that? It's exactly this time of the Arch of Titus. So, okay. Now, one last amazing thing that relates the Roman community to this, to the way that they kind of changed their understanding following the rise of the state of Israel. Okay? And this is an amazing postscript to the story of Rabbi Israel Zoli. The postscript that would never have happened had there never been a state of Israel. Okay, let me read the description. This is apparently from Rabbi Riskin's account. I'm just gonna read it because I wouldn't be able to say it better than he said it himself. So this is all a quote. Okay, he said, exactly 10 years ago, a young man with a heavy European accent appeared at my doorstep on a summer Friday afternoon and asked me to convert him to Judaism. I invited him to stay for Shabbat, and he introduced himself as the great-grandson of Rabbi Israel Zoli, who had been appointed chief rabbi of Rome in 1939. The Nazis took over the city in September of 1943, and Rabbi Zoli hid out in the Vatican. And for reasons clouded in mystery, he, together and his wife and daughter Miriam, converted to Christianity on February 14th, 1945. One of my students prepared him for conversion, and he moved to a religious kibbutz in northern Israel. Okay, so pause. This is Rabbi Zoli's great-grandson, who has come asking to convert, is now living in a kibbutz in northern Israel, preparing for conversion. Okay, so let's go back to the quote. So 2 years later, he came to me with his bride-to-be, asked me to perform their marriage ceremony. It stipulated that it be in his great-grandfather's synagogue in Rome. The matrimonial service was the most moving of my career, and it took place only a few days before Yom Kippur, as I intoned the final of the Sheva Brachot, of the 7 nuptial blessings, which says, I'm going to say it in Hebrew, Od Yishama be'arei Yehuda v'chutzot Yerushalayim kol sason v'kol simcha kol chatan the kol kala, the groom shouted out, great-grandfather, do you hear these words? I wanted to come here to get married because I wanted to be a repair, a tikkun for your soul. You did not believe that these words would ever come to pass. You apparently thought that Judaism had been destroyed by the Nazi hordes, but you were wrong. I am proof that you were wrong. I have come back, and since a great part of my returning is because of you, I have brought you back with me. Grandfather, the eternal one of Israel does not speak falsehood, right? It's a Yisrael lo yishaker. Grandfather, Am Yisrael Chai. That's the end. That's the end of the quote. Okay, so let's just recap. I think that here's a rather let's just end with this. This is not to say that the founding of the state of Israel ended the siege under which Jews have lived, and in many ways continue to live. Okay? In fact, the state of Israel itself has been under siege since the day of its founding. So Zionism hasn't proven itself as the antidote to the siege. But Zionism was successful in changing the way that Jews in general kind of woke up to the reality of their situation. As I said before, the arch was the same, the history was the same, but the people walking through it were somehow different afterwards. And perhaps what Zionism helped to do was to wake Jewish people up to the idea that living under siege is a tragedy and is not tolerable. And that something had to be done about it, and that waiting it out was not a strategy that always works. And perhaps that's kind of a modern message that we can take away from the fast of 10th of Tevet. Because for generations, Jews mourned and fasted on this day that commemorates an ancient siege that took place some 2,600 years ago. And for much of our history, the people fasting and mourning on this day understood all too well what it meant to live under siege because they were living under siege. But perhaps a message of the day that they were meant to internalize was that 10th of Tevet isn't just about mourning a siege that was. It's also a day that teaches us lessons about the present, and specifically that it's a tragedy for Jews to live under siege in any time. And so hopefully that inspires us to take action in our days as well. And so I'll leave everyone with that. Should have an easy fast and look forward to learning with everyone next month.